Freedom Day, February 1st, 2025, at Mitchelville Freedom Park, Hilton Head, South Carolina. Special guest Edda L. Fields Black. Dr. Edda L. Fields Black is a professor in the Department of History and the director of the Dietrich College Humanities Center at Carnegie Mellon University. Author of Combee, Harriet Tubman, the Combahee River Raid, and Black Freedom during the Civil War.
So, something I did not say when Angie was up here, just so you understand the importance and significance of this event. Historic Mitchelville Freedom Park is in collaboration with the Office of Cultural Affairs for Hilton Head Island, meaning we have their continuing support to present this exhibit, sharing cost and programming opportunity. I now have a distinct pleasure. I just met this woman, but I was taken by her warmth and her scholar. Mrs. Edda Fields Black, and I will refer to her from this point on as Dr. Edda. She gave me permission to do that. Is a leading scholar on Harriet Tubman and on Rice. She has very deep roots in South Carolina. Her family was enslaved on the Rice plantations in Colleton River, South Carolina. Her great-great-great, and I want to make sure I got that, her great-great-great-grandfather fought in the Combee River Raid in June 1863. And I am just so pleased at that because I'm doing my own historical roots, and for Black folk, we can't always go back that far. So I think it's amazing that she can. She understands through her scholar, through her research, the impact of rice cultivation on African American and the history of African Americans in this country. She told me as we were meeting, she gave me some other awards that she's gotten for her books that are on sale over there, and I have it on my phone. So give me a minute. I just found this out, so I asked her to email it to me. So I'm going to swipe and open my phone because this is very important data that you need to know. Okay, here we go. For her book that is on sale on the table there, she has achieved some awards. Combee, Harriet Tubman and the Combee River Raid, and Black Freedom during the Civil War. And this is just recently developed. She is the winner of the Association of Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. She's the 2024 Marcia M. Greenland History Award that she's just won. She's a finalist for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History Book Prize. She is a finalist for the South Carolina Historical Society's George C. Rogers Jr. Award. She was nominated the Best Nonfiction Book of 2024 by Bloomberg. She was also recommended on the Best Books of 2024 by the New Yorker. She is the Best Civil War Books in 2024 by the Civil War Monitor. She's one of the top 10 history books of 2024 by Booklist. And she has won the prize for the Oxford University's Best Books of 2024. This woman has a very strong credibility. And when you meet her and get a chance to hear her story, you will understand why these organizations have chosen to give her these awards. So this is what we're going to do. She's going to come up and give us a give us some conversation, give us some history. And then she and I will have the opportunity to sit down and have a discussion. And if you have questions or something you'd like to say to her, feel free to do that at this time. So without any further ado, I would like to present to you Dr. Edda Fields Black.
Good morning, Mitchelville. Happy Freedom Day. It is wonderful to be with you today, and I am grateful to Ahmad Ward. I'm grateful to Joyce Wright for bringing me here to tell you a little bit about Combee and to talk about the very rich history that is here in Mitchelville. And we're going to talk about what happened on June 1st of 1863 when Harriet Tubman and her group of spies, scouts, and pilots piloted Colonel James Montgomery, who was the commander of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, and these were 300 black soldiers, and one company of the 3rd Rhode Island Heavy Artillery, and this was a battery of white soldiers, up the sleepy, serpentine Combee River under the light of the full moon and during the springtide in 3 armed gunboats. One was a retrofitted gunboat and 2 were transport steamers. And it's about 9 p.m. in June, and so it was just good and dark when they left the wharf in downtown Beaufort. And they traveled north and went up through the Beaufort River. And the only real opposition they found were sandbars and floating sandbars at the mouth of the Coosaw River. One of the boats ran aground, and this must have devastated Tubman, her spies, scouts, and pilots, and the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, almost all of whom were formerly enslaved, right? Because this cut the carrying capacity of the mission in half. There were 2 transport steamers, 1 ran aground. That meant they would only be able to bring back half as many freedom seekers. Yet they soldiered on. 2 boats, a gunboat and a transport steamer, continued up the river. And they stopped first at Fields Point, and no relation as far as I know, but I had the pleasure, with the collaboration of Historic Mitchelville and Joe McGill's Slave Dwelling Project, we did a sleepover at Fields Point, right on the Combee River, in June of 2023, celebrating the 160th anniversary of the Combee River Raid, and that was a lot of fun. So the boats continue from there to Tar Bluff and into the mouth of the Combee River. Now, for those of us who study rice, okay, I said June. That should conjure up in your mind, this is the sickly season. This is the season when the rice is growing in the rice fields, rice grows in stagnant water, and mosquitoes breed in stagnant water. So the Confederate Army had relocated its troops, okay, and only left pickets, guards, at the mouth of the Combee River and then at Combee Ferry, which today is the Harriet Tubman Bridge. So as the U.S. Army in these 2 boats approach Fields Point, this is the location of the first set of pickets at the mouth of the Combee River, the Confederate pickets flee. There's a newspaper account that talks about how they left so fast, they left their blankets warm. They got out of Dodge, okay? This was the first landing place of the 2nd South Carolina. This is the first place where the 2nd South Carolina disembark. They're on land, they're on Confederate territory. This is the beginning, if you will, of the action of the Combee River Raid. The pickets flee, they call for reinforcements. Reinforcements are 15 miles away, okay, by horseback. So that's gonna take some time. All right, the boats continue. The gunboat, the transport steamer. The transport steamer lands, again, 4 a.m. They land at 4 a.m. on Long Brow Plantation. And it's 4 a.m. And we know from an account by a man, a freedom seeker by the name of Minus Hamilton, who I tell people is the star of the show, 88-year-old man who told his story of freedom, that the enslaved people were in the rice fields at 4 a.m. How many of you have been in a rice field at 4 a.m.? Okay, I'm here to tell you that on the Combee, and I know this because I've spent a considerable amount of time on 8 of the 9 plantations that were raided, a considerable amount of time. They walked a mile from the slave cabins, on average, to the rice fields in the dark, when they could not see their hand in front of their faces, and they could not see the snakes, copperheads, rattlesnakes, what's the other one? Water moccasins, there we go, at their feet as they're walking through the grass, or the alligators in the water as they're standing in water, probably up to their ankles this time of year. The rice was growing in the fields, so the water would have been drawn down as the enslaved people hoed. Couldn't see their long-handled hoes in front of their faces, let alone their hands, let alone the gators, let alone the snakes, okay? So Minus Hamilton tells us where they are and what they were doing. And that transport steamer, so from that transport steamer at Long Brow, it sent out rowboats. And that rowboat went south and picked up Minus Hamilton and his wife. The gunboat kept going. The gunboat kept going. And this was the lead boat. That's the boat Harriet Tubman was on, with her ring of spies, scouts, and pilots. She tells us in her pension file that she was the commander of 8 or 9 men. And we knew the names of those men from her biographers, from documents that were written for her as she attempted to get compensated from the federal government for her Civil War service. In Combee, we actually learn more about those men than we've ever known before, okay? Many of them had been engaged in other raids that the U.S. Army and Navy conducted in this region, some as far north as the Santee River. One was a career spy, right? Tubman is the one who found these men in Beaufort. She recruited them. She put this ring together. She trained them. And then she led them, and they led Colonel James Montgomery up the river. Okay, so the second boat, the John Adams, docked at Combee Ferry. And as I've said, today Combee Ferry is called the Harriet Tubman Bridge. How many people have been over that bridge? Some people may have come over the bridge today. It's one of my favorite spots. So during the Civil War, that was what was called a pontoon bridge. It was a temporary kind of bridge made out of wooden boats that the Confederacy or the Union, they could put it down and kind of put planks over it. And Sherman crossed his army over pontoon bridges. They could be very sturdy. They could cross large bodies of water. But once the horses got on one side, they took it up so their enemy couldn't come behind them, right? So it was a temporary kind of structure. Well, we know that the Combee planters and slaveholders, after the Battle of Port Royal in November of 1861, they put obstructions in the Combee River. So the John Adams goes up beyond the pontoon bridge, encounters the instructions, and comes back. And it parks at Combee Ferry. It commands the river. It was the boat that had the largest guns. The guns still were not very big. Compared to the U.S. Navy, they were little guns, but they were larger than what the Confederacy had. And so from that position, it was able to shoot down on the Confederate reinforcements that had now come down. And remember that this was the second location of the Confederate pickets. So they're also sending couriers for reinforcements. Okay, so at this time, more soldiers are getting out. They got out at Long Brow, they get out at Combee Ferry. We know from the Confederate record that they marched up and down the banks of the Combee River, blowing whistles and waving flags. One of these 2nd South Carolina volunteer soldiers who would have been up at Combee Ferry with Harriet Tubman was Hector Fields, my great-great-great-grandfather. And I did not know those details about Hector Fields' life until I wrote this book, right? That is one of the many blessings of Combee. And I hope we're just at the beginning of this process, that it's going to help people find their family members, particularly people on the Sea Islands as well as in the rice growing areas, because many of the soldiers who were in the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, the 1st and the 3rd, came from Beaufort and the Sea Islands. They enlisted after the Battle of Port Royal because these are some of the first freed African Americans during the Civil War. So people in this audience likely have ancestors in those regiments. People in this audience likely have ancestors, and one of them, I can't remember the lady who was honored, who I want to learn more about. I know Mr. Campbell, I don't know Mrs. Wright Watkins? Wright. Mrs. Wright. Okay, that's a family that had an ancestor who served in the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. They were in this raid. If they were in regiments A through F, they fought in the raid with Harriet Tubman. G and H were the companies. G and H were the companies that were formed from the Combee men, the Combee Freedom Seekers. Okay, so the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, some of these men freed after Port Royal, up until a week or two before the raid, okay? Because people were constantly coming from Confederate occupied territory into Beaufort, Port Royal, and the Sea Islands, seeking U.S. protection. Some of these men, this was their first time in uniform. This was their first time handling their muskets. Friday Barrington was a man from the Combee, from Cypress Plantation on the Combee, who liberated himself before the raid and joined up with Colonel James Montgomery. Friday Barrington actually joined the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, went back to Cyprus and freed his family. His parents, his sister, and his brother-in-law. And then his brother-in-law, Robert Frazier, enlists in the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers as well. So as these men are walking over a causeway that connected Cypress Plantation to Combee Ferry, where the John Adams was located, this causeway, which is really just a raised embankment of earth, I'm here to tell you, is surrounded on all sides by rice fields. And they didn't know. They couldn't see. They didn't know if the Confederates were going to pick them off. By this time, the Confederate reinforcements had arrived, so there are skirmishes. It's the John Adams that is shooting down at the Confederacy. And these freedom seekers are running for their lives. They are running for their lives and their freedom, okay? The soldiers go on to the plantations, burn 7 rice plantations to the ground. And because of where I am, I'm sure you all know what a plantation looked like. It's not one building, it's not one house. Certainly there would be, we could call it a manor house, but we're talking multiple buildings, barns, kitchens, stables, and these barns were full of last year's rice harvest, right? Burned everything on 7 plantations on the Combee. Only one house was saved, and that house was not burned because you had to cross a swamp to get to it, okay? The soldiers also opened the floodgates. I said there was rice growing in the rice fields, and this is a long story, but the hydraulic irrigation system that's built by enslaved Africans maintains a delicate balance of fresh water and salt water. So if you open the floodgates and let the Combee River in, you've ruined the rice harvest. You've ruined the crop for 1863. It's a lot of money. They also destroyed the pontoon bridge that went over the Combee River, the wooden bridge I talked about. They tore it up, destroyed it. That way Confederate reinforcements couldn't come from that direction either. 756 people were liberated. And I argue in Combee that this was the largest slave revolt in US history, the largest and the most successful, okay? And if you think about the history of the New World, the entire New World, the Combee River Raid was second only to the Haitian Revolution. Okay, so what I wanted to do in Combee was I wanted to document Harriet Tubman's Civil War service when she served as a spy, a scout, and a nurse. She was a laundress, she was a cook. For the U.S. Army Department of the South, she wore many, many hats. And as I started thinking about the book, my assumption first was, well, don't we know everything about Harriet Tubman's life? And as it turned out, her Civil War service was the least known part of her legendary life. And I set out to tell the story of the Combee River Raid from the perspective of Harriet Tubman and from the perspective of the Combee freedom seekers whom she liberated. And I wanted to put the reader in the rice fields. I wanted to put the reader in the rice fields with the freedom seekers when they heard and smelled and felt, because of course it's 4 o'clock in the morning, so they couldn't see the boats coming up the river. They heard them, they smelled them, they felt them. They felt those vibrations, they smelled that smoke. They heard the whistles. And they knew it was freedom. They knew it was freedom. So I wanted to put the reader in their shoes as they realize that freedom had finally come and they ran for their lives toward it. The main characters of my story, of course, are Harriet Tubman. And there is a lot of new information in the book about Tubman's life, about her Civil War service. So we know now that she was working in downtown Beaufort in the refugee camps. And these refugee camps were on the front lines as freedom seekers came from Confederate occupied territory into the area of U.S. occupation. The refugee camps in downtown Beaufort were really the places where their needs were assessed. Did they need food, clothing, medical care? Could they work, right? Did they have ties or family members who were on Sea Island plantations? Because they could be sent to the Sea Islands, right, to work, to farm, to grow Sea Island cotton. They could be enlisted in the U.S. Army after January 1st, 1863, okay? And there were women working for the U.S. military in Beaufort. And some of those people were from the Combee, so I'm able to track Combee freedom seekers who escaped during the raid. And I mentioned Friday Barrington, who went back. Okay, so I learned a lot about Harriet Tubman from the letters of the teachers and the missionaries and the other Northern volunteers who came down as part of the Port Royal experiment. And I'm able to document many of the folks who were writing about Tubman were from Massachusetts. These were people Tubman knew in the 1850s when she was an integral part of abolitionist networks, particularly in Massachusetts, but also in Philadelphia and New York. These people wrote home about Tubman. They saw her and they wrote to their family members about what she was doing in the refugee camps, for example. George Garrison, Sergeant George Garrison, who was William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist's son, wrote that Tubman, quote, made it a business to see all contrabands escaping from the rebels and is able to get more intelligence from them than anyone else. So the people came from the Confederate territory. She interviewed them. She found out what they knew, and she passed it on to the Union. Charlotte Fortin's diary also tells us a lot about Tubman. Charlotte actually visited, she and her roommate, Lizzie Hunn, actually visited with Tubman and spent the day with her in her home at the Savon House in downtown Beaufort. And Charlotte Fortin was just in awe of Harriet Tubman, okay? She was in awe of Harriet Tubman, called her a wonderful woman, a real heroine. And Tubman told them stories of the Underground Railroad. And Fortin's roommate, the father of Fortin's roommate, had actually been, and I quote, their house had been the first known railroad stop on Tubman's route to freedom. So he had been part of the Underground Railroad and knew Harriet Tubman from Delaware, from Philadelphia, had helped her bring freedom seekers from the Maryland Eastern Shore to freedom. Okay. And we know that Tubman's activities were not confined to Beaufort, right? They weren't confined to the downtown area, to Port Royal or the Sea Islands, thanks to this new research. Number one, she was attached to General Isaac Ingalls Stevenson after the Battle of Port Royal, and he was the commander of the U.S. Army troops. Well, Stevenson brought freedom seekers down the Combee and took them to Beaufort before the raid. And I'm able to document that some of those freedom seekers were enslaved by the Blake family, Arthur Blake, and Walter Blake's plantation got taken out in the Combee River raid, okay? And some of these people at one point had all been on the Combee. So it's possible that Tubman was a part of these reconnaissance missions. I'm able to document that there were reconnaissance missions, Army and Navy, on the Combee before the raid. And Tubman was attached to the commander who conducted them. She was likely involved, right? She was likely involved. Okay, and we know that she went to a nighttime burial, and a ring shout could have been here in Hilton Head. It was somewhere in U.S. occupied territory. It was likely on the Sea Islands where there are plantations versus in downtown Beaufort. And when Tubman went to this ring shout, and then the teachers, the northern teachers wrote about ring shouts all the time, right? Charlotte Fortin wrote about ring shouts. She and her roommate Lizzie Hunn went to plenty of ring shouts, but they were always on the outside. They were spectators, okay? Charlotte writes about how she and Lizzie stood up against the wall and watched. When Tubman went to the ring shout, she participated. They called her into the circle and recognized her as part of the community. And I suggest this means that she wasn't just at where the Army was, okay? She wasn't just downtown. And there are Civil War historians who've argued that, oh, you know, she didn't get off the boat, she wasn't really there. She was there, and she was operating undercover in this region, in the region, and bringing the information from people in the region to the U.S. Army. Okay, the last piece I will say, and this is probably, I won't say it's the most important piece, but it's the piece that has gotten the most attention, and rightfully so, because Tubman and her ring of spies, scouts, and pilots found out that the Combee River had been mined with torpedoes. She found the men, the enslaved men, who had been forced to mine it with torpedoes. She and her spies, scouts, and pilots took those men back to the site, and the U.S. Army defused and removed the torpedoes. It's on the basis of this research, and this happened in Veterans Day of 2024, that Governor Wes Moore of Maryland commissioned Harriet Tubman, Brigadier General of the Maryland National Guard. And it's on the basis of this research that we finally got a legal opinion, okay, from the U.S. Army that Harriet Tubman was a soldier, that she was a soldier. And it's on the basis of that legal opinion and this research that we are fighting for her to get the Medal of Honor. We didn't get it before Biden left office. Very disappointed about that, but myself, Kate Larson, who is one of Harriet Tubman's biographers, the whole team at the U.S. Army, we're continuing to push, we're continuing the fight, because she deserves it. Okay. The last piece I'll say is the book is also about the freedom seekers. It's about the people who liberated themselves in the raid. The main characters are people like Minus Hamilton, who was in the rice fields, 88 years old, who remembered the raid. And they remember the raid in life's histories that they dictated. They remembered the raid in their U.S. Civil War pension files. I usually say a lot about the pension files in my book talks. I'm gonna say less today, okay? I'm gonna say less because I hope I'm preaching to the choir. I hope that people in this audience know that the pension files are the way that you can, as I did, hear your great, for some of you, grandparents talk about enslavement and freedom. That if you haven't done so already, you will run home. And when I say run, I mean run. And go to Ancestry and go to Family Search and see if you have a U.S. Civil War veteran in your family. And if so, or widow, you will request that pension file, okay? And listen to them tell their side of the story about who held them in bondage and where, what happened to them and their family before the war, how they were married to their partner, right? Who visited them during the births of their children, who buried them, all kinds of just really intimate details that historians have never seen before. For in the slave quarters, we get in Combee about the Combee freedom seekers because of their U.S. Civil War pension files, okay? But I'm gonna just mention also that because of those files, I was able to take other documents, like Elizabeth Botum's memoir. And I choose Botum because she was a Boston teacher who ran the school on Port Royal. And that school was the refugee camp where the Combee freedom seekers were housed, where the Combee freedom seekers were educated, where some of the Combee freedom seekers stayed after the war. And these are the people who did not enlist in the Army, okay? 150 men aged 14 to 70 enlisted in the Army the day after the raid. That means about 600 people were rehoused at Port Royal. Yes, at Old Fort Plantation on Port Royal. And so I'm able to trace people like Sarah and Primus Barnwell, Isaac and Sylvia DeCoster, Old Leah, November, Sarah and Nat Osborne, Smart, Mary, and Solomon Washington. And Smart was the man, Smart Washington, who enlisted in the 2nd South Carolina at age 70. And to understand how these people from the rice plantations understood their identity, right? At the time, they saw themselves as different than the people who had been enslaved on the Sea Islands and who were forced to grow Sea Island cotton. But also to show that this Civil War era was really the crucible. This U.S. occupation was the time that brought these groups together where they could experience their commonalities and become what we call today the Gullah Geechee, right? And so Combee gets its name from what the freedom seekers at Old Fort Plantation, the Combee freedom seekers, called themselves. They told Elizabeth Botum, oh, we's Combee, okay? We's Combee, we're from the rice plantations. We don't have white folks around us much of the year. We do our thing, right? We have these different skills. This is who we are. Okay, I'm gonna end with a short reading, and I hope that you're gonna join me at the end because it is Freedom Day, and we are celebrating freedom in Mitchelville. What a privilege that is. And we're not very far from Tabernacle Baptist Church, so the freedom seekers sail all night after the raid, okay? The raid is over in the afternoon, they get on the boat, they sail all night, they get back to Beaufort. At Beaufort, they arrive, and I can't read the whole thing, but it's very touching because people who had been freed since November 1861, the Battle of Port Royal, turned out to see this spectacle. And the newspapers wrote about it and they described it. 756 people who were straight out of the rice fields with, they call them the dirty gray field clothes that they wore that morning to forced labor at 4 a.m., standing in pluff mud after walking a mile through snakes and standing there fighting off alligators so they could grow rice for somebody else, right? These are the people who ran to the boat. They get to Beaufort and they walk down Bay Street, okay? They walk down Bay Street and everybody turns out to see them. They go to Tabernacle Baptist Church, okay? And there's now a monument to Harriet Tubman and the Combee River Raid. And this is where Harriet Tubman gives a speech. All right, so according to one of the columnists, a speech by the Black woman followed Colonel James Montgomery's address. The speaker was not just any Black woman, though there were certainly hundreds of them in the room. Women who had liberated themselves from freedom in the raid, women who had liberated themselves from bondage in Beaufort and the surrounding sea islands as early as the Battle of Port Royal. Since the other two Black women who took part in the Port Royal experiment, Charlotte Fortin and Susie King Taylor, were not on the scene, it could only have been one Black woman who addressed the crowd at the church in downtown Beaufort the day after the raid. Harriet Tubman, quote, the woman who led the raid and under whose inspiration it was originated and conducted, unquote. Tubman gave the Combee refugees a lecture full of soundness and real native eloquence, which would do any man honor, and that's a quote. Without a transcript, we're left to wonder which words Tubman chose to deliver to the crowd. She certainly told her story of growing up in and escaping bondage. She probably spoke of liberating freedom seekers and rescue missions for over a decade and giving instructions to others. She likely spoke to the throngs of freedom speakers in the Beaufort Church that day about the responsibilities of freedom. Nor is there a record of whether she raised her melodious voice in song, as she often did when speaking about her experiences as a bondsperson, self-liberator, and conductor on the Underground Railroad. If she sang to the assembled crowd, all of whom would surely have preferred death to a return to bondage, and I want you to join me, she might have chosen, "Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free." Happy Freedom Day.
My first words to Dr. Edda was, what a treat, what a delight, what a delight. She brought that story so that you could really see yourself along with those freedom seekers. And that's the first time I've heard them refer to that, and I love that. Before I go any further, and I know you're going to have all kinds of questions and or comments for her, I want to recognize, because I understand that when we have people that do the kind of work that she's done, that travel the miles, that talk to the people, there's always someone behind them that's keeping them centered and keeping them on task. And that is her husband, Sam. Sam, would you please stand? So that we also know who you are, because I know she shares with you. So I'm going to ask just one question to start us off, and it's only one because I'm expecting the questions from you, audience. How long did it take you? And kind of, I guess, talk to us about the kind of research that you had to do to bring this story alive.
So, believe it or not, I started writing Combee in earnest in 2020. But I have to qualify that because I had been working on probably 2 other books, and I was casting about trying to figure out what story I wanted to tell. And I think the first step was figuring out that I did want to tell a story, which is not really what academic historians are trained to do. So I was trying to figure things out, and I was doing research, and I actually wrote 2 very bad chapters about the Civil War, which maybe 2 paragraphs survive in the book, but it was the research for those chapters that became foundational to Combee. So something like Elizabeth Botum, and finding out that, oh, wow, these are the Combee refugees, right? Finding Minus Hamilton's story. He told his story to Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was the commander of the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. It's maybe 3 pages long of a formerly enslaved man telling his story of bondage and freedom in perfect Gullah. I was like, oh, there's something here. I don't know what yet, but I thought I carried that with me for a couple of years. So I was really, 2019, through a friend, I was introduced to the current landowners of the Combee plantations. And I had all of these grandiose plans that I was going to be on the Combee, right? 2019, this was December. And February rolled around, I signed a book contract, and March, everything shut down, right? So I had these pieces in place. I had also done quite a bit of archival research, 2017 and 2018. And the pension files, I had found the pension files. I really didn't know the power of them, but I had found some of the pension files. I'd found that some of the Combee, some of the veterans talked about the Combee River Raid in their pension files. That I had found. I hadn't realized that I could recreate the Combee enslaved community from the pension files yet. That didn't come until I found my own ancestors' pension file. So things were coming in drips and drabs, and I finally got enough together to get a book contract and thought that I had something to say, and then the world, shut down. So it was a process, but the actual writing of it was really 2020 to 2023.
Fabulous, fantastic. What questions do we have in the audience for Dr. Edda? Yes.
Companies 2nd South Carolina or USCT, the 34th Regiment, companies G and H were formed after the raid, and companies A through F fought in the raid.
Okay. I have my great-great-grandfather's pension file right here, and he was in Company G.
Oh, what was his name?
Caesar Kirk Jones.
Let's talk.
Okay.
I love it.
Another question. Do you have? You have the mic out there. I have.
Oh, there we go.
I want to know a little bit more about how Tubman blended in with her community, because what I did hear is that, oh, she wouldn't have understood people down here because she didn't speak Gullah, or she would have been, or even in, Sarah Bradford's book, she says, well, I didn't really understand them. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So I talk about this in Combee, and I talk about the duality of it, right? Because Tubman says very plainly in the biography that Sarah Bradford wrote, which she dictated, she told her life story. She's like, I couldn't understand them people, right? And they laughed when I talked, and she's very clear that there were these linguistic differences. Now, I use that to talk about this larger process of creolization, and throughout the book, I'm really sort of distinguish, if you will, the South Carolina and Georgia Lowcountry from the Maryland Eastern Shore. And there's a larger creolization process that's happening among Black people, and we could cut it and say, we could say the New World, we could say the whole Black world. We could talk about the U.S. South. And so that creolization process in Maryland is very different from South Carolina, in large part because of the slave trade. And the fact that you have these African-born people in coastal South Carolina who are arriving a couple years before the Civil War, right? So I'm talking about these larger processes and how they were really different. You had Black cultures in different parts of the U.S. South that were different. And on the flip side of that, I say, however, the one thing these folks had in common, and they recognized Harriet Tubman for it, was freedom. They had freedom. They didn't have to speak the same language. And interestingly enough, and I kind of wish I had brought this out more, there were also some things that were foundational, that were common. When I'm using the pension files, I'm really trying to understand how our enslaved ancestors saw themselves, right? And I also juxtapose the enslaved community with the planter community and what we know about each and how we know it and how each functioned and how they organize themselves. Well, my point there is that the enslaved community on the Combee is organized by age, right? It's a hierarchy by age. And so I talk about the old heads. Well, all of this language comes from the pension files. People talk about the old heads. Like, oh, every old head around here knows I've been married to that man and only that man for my entire life. Sometimes that wasn't true. But anyway. Well, Harriet Tubman talks about old heads also, right? So thinking about your community as a hierarchy by age is also something that among Black people that cuts across these linguistic differences. Does that make sense? So I'm looking at them both. I'm looking at the differences, but then I'm also saying there are some deep underlying commonalities. And, okay, that's all I'm going to say about that.
It's a simple question. How old was General Tubman when she led this group? How old was Harriet Tubman?
How old was she when she led the raid?
Right.
41. Yeah.
How long did she live after that?
Woo. A long life. Yeah, 50 years. Yeah. Yeah. Doing a good job.
Hey, so my question for you is, during your research process, what was probably the hardest part of it, and what was the most interesting thing that you personally found?
Yeah. I think the hardest part, okay, I could define hard in a lot of ways. I think the most challenging thing was that we still couldn't connect all the dots. And that's to be expected, because, you know, there's so many things that are new about this kind of research, okay? So if you think about enslaved people and how do we know their stories, we know it pre-Combee, 2 ways: slave narratives from them, slave narratives and WPA interviews. So what I'm showing is that with the US Civil War pension files, now that's 3, okay? Then you have the fact that Beaufort and Colleton counties, I'm told, were burned counties, okay? Which means that during the Civil War, Sherman came through and he burned the county records. And for one of them, and I should remember this, they actually took the county records to Columbia. And so Sherman came through and burned them in Columbia. So the people who tell me this, and they're Civil War historians and, you know, 19th century Americanists, which I'm neither of, tell me this, they would tell me this to say, oh, you're not gonna find anything, little girl, you're just, you know, blowing smoke. Okay, well, of the families, the 7 families, and their slave transactions, because in the pension files, people talk about how they got to the Combee. Okay, they were born here, and they were bought and sold and mortgaged and given away and turned over from one family member to another. And I'm documenting all of this with sources, slave bills, mortgages, etc. Which would have, they would have assumed were in the county archives. Well, they were, but they were in Charleston. So nobody looked. 1865 to 2024, they didn't look. So 2 counties of African American history right here have been opened up. So what's hard about that, that's an accomplishment, that's an achievement. I'm very proud of that. But what will keep me up at night is the fact that there's still maybe 4 slave transactions that I couldn't find, right? There are still families I could not document. That in my database of Combee freedom seekers from the pension files, I can name the soldiers, and I haven't been able to put them on a family tree. I don't know what plantation they were born on. I don't know where they were in bondage. I don't know how they got to the Combee, and I just have to keep looking. So that's hard. The other thing is that, you know, doing research on slavery is not easy. And maybe we don't talk about it enough. It is not easy. I cried my eyes out on a daily basis. I cried. I cried, I cried, I cried, I cried. And I tried, plus it was 2020 and it was the racial, it was a lot going on, and it was COVID. What I tried to do is to put that emotion into the book and to really respect the fact that I'm humbled to be the vehicle through which the story is told. And I'm humbled to be the keeper of these stories of our ancestors, right? And so try to do them justice and try to convey to my audience, not in an academic and a what's that word they use, objective, intellectual way, but in a very emotional way. I wanted people to feel this history. So if I was crying my eyes out and I could get to a point where I could write it in a way that the reader would feel it, then I had done my job.
There's a question in the back in the green.
I noticed you mentioned in your research, did you find any connection between Charlotte Fortin and Penn School?
Yes, absolutely. Charlotte Fortin that's where she taught. You know, that's where she lived. And she has in her diary just, beautiful descriptions about her time there. And this is a young woman who was, I try in Combee to show how different she was from Harriet Tubman. She was quite a bit younger. I say she was young enough to be Tubman's daughter. Some people have disagreed with me. But if you do the math and you know that enslaved women were sometimes forced to have children at 14 years old, she was old, Tubman could have been her daughter. And she's from a free family in Philadelphia. She was the 4th generation in her family born free. 4 generations of freedom. And they could have been they were comfortable. This was a very wealthy family, and they had been wealthy for a long time, right? But they could have been comfortable in their wealth and ignored the plight of enslaved people, and they didn't do that, right? They didn't do that. They were staunch abolitionists. They were staunch abolitionists, and they raised this girl in the movement. And she's one of those kids. And I talked about the Northern teachers and the, connection to the abolitionist movement. Many of these folks, like George Garrison, these are the children of abolitionists who left school and came down here after the Battle of Port Royal to help the freedom seekers adjust to freedom, in quotes. Charlotte Fortin is one of those people. She could have been very comfortable in Philadelphia or in Massachusetts. She could have gotten married. She could have taught safely and comfortably, continued to do so up in the North. But she came down here, to be a part of freedom.
We have run out of time. I know you guys have other questions, but to our benefit, Dr. Eddy would be here for a while, and yes, you can catch her after the program.
I'll be in the back signing books at the table, so please come and ask. Let's talk more about your questions. Thank you.
So if we could give her a rounding applause.